Hello, welcome to Pixel Fondue this fine Friday. Sunny day in Silicon Valley, and we've got game artist Elliot Sharp with us today straight from Jonesboro, Arkansas. Is that correct, Elliot?
That's correct. Out here in the middle of nowhere. Yeah.
Out there in the middle. Do you have the coolest job in Jonesboro, Arkansas?
I'm pretty sure that I do. Yeah.
You must. You must be. And I was talking to Elliot earlier. Well, actually, let me give a little background before we get into this. Like lots of people, I peruse ArtStation while I'm waiting for a render or just killing time. And I came across some of Elliot's work, which I'll show here in a little bit. And I didn't know who he was. I just thought it's like, wow, these are really well done models and texturing, and immaculately modeled textured weapons primarily. And I don't know, remember a few weeks later, I got a tweet out from William Vaughn saying, here's a cool model done with some mop booleans. It's a plugin that William had done for MODO. And I looked at the page and I was like, oh, that's that guy who did those cool weapons. I asked William for Elliot's email and he sent it over to me, and here we are. Elliot, why don't you give us a little background on yourself first, a little bit how you got into the industry, how long you've been working, why you're still in Jonesboro, something along those lines. So, you're younger than me. I've been in this industry since the late '90s. When did you first get into it?
So I guess really I got started with 3D modeling around 2009. I started with 3ds Max version 9, if that tells you anything.
And, version 9, okay. I used version 1. That's the difference.
Yeah, very much. A little bit later, the ball game.
A little bit later, 2009. Okay, so that's it's 8 years now. That's not a short amount of time.
Time definitely has flown by. We started in product design for a while, and it was pretty much hard surface modeling like you see in games. Just use that for really what's akin to now. Concept design in games has become largely 3D, and it was sort of the same process just for products that didn't exist yet, right?
So how did you start in product design? Do you have a design a background, like an educational background in design, or?
So humorously, like my education is in business, but I had some connections that worked at a large manufacturing company, and they had an idea to do an offshoot. So they would sell things a lot different than what they currently were, and we got together, and it just became a very steady sort of growth from there, right? Evolving different products, different times, different markets, and it was interesting. But
what sort of products? Like you're hard surface modeling, just concept products in Max? That's how you got into that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we did a lot of glassware, which sounds weird, but in practice it's actually kind of hard because to get realistic looking glass is challenging. And I just sort of worked out of there, used Max for a long time, but always wanted to get into games. And it seemed impossible when I first started, right? Because, it's like games, I don't know.
Yeah,
I live out here in the middle of nowhere.
Well,
really,
let's see.
It's
2009. What was out in 2009? I'm trying to think. Like Half-Life 2 was around 2005, right?
Yeah, I guess Crysis was 2007.
So. Crysis. That would get some people interested in games. I just saw there's been a number of Crysis retrospectives. Oh, it's like the 10-year anniversary, I guess.
Right. Okay. That was why it's on my mind, I'm sure. Yeah.
Let me tell you, man, Crysis. Like I always think of Half-Life 2, Doom 3 as sort of the next level up, at least in terms of PC gaming around 2005. Crysis was just like stepping foot. It was like just jumping into the future. I mean, if you had the hardware, it was just
right.
Yeah, I did because I was a professional 3D animator. So
there you go.
Fortunately, was probably one of the few people who could play that thing. And oh my god, that game was. I still play that once again every year. I think.
Yeah, it's good to check it out on modern hardware. See.
Oh yeah, it still looks awesome. It still looks fantastic. Okay, so you're looking at the games. You're like, okay, I want to get into this, but you're making glassware.
Right? Yeah, it's very weird, but a lot of the skill set does transfer over, right? I mean,
so the skill set. So you're self-taught in using Max. So you've got some skills, you have the desire to work in the gaming industry. Like a lot of people, I think you find yourself in a position like, this is really what I want to do.
Right.
So how do you, especially just not being in a city where you're going to bump into people whose day job is working at a game company, how do you get your foot in the door in Jonesboro, Arkansas?
Yeah, it's extra tough, right? Because you don't know anybody in the industry. You can't just shoot off a portfolio if all of your work has been for a sort of totally different genre of 3D work, right? I mean, really, I drew a lot of inspiration from like Tor Frick and Reno Levy, Lone Wolf 3D.
Okay.
And those guys. And I was looking, I was like, if I'm going to get into this, I've got to try and be that good, right?
Yep.
So really, I took all of my sort of old hard surface modeling experience for high poly work, sub-D work, and I was like, okay, I'm going to learn the rest of the pipeline. I'm just going to hit it. And that's what I did. And I started putting work out there. People liked it. I really, really refined the process. And eventually it just leads to people reaching out to you,
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of the same story I hear over and over as I talk to people who are successfully getting work in this industry. They set high goals, and there's just no way around it. You've got to bust your ass.
Yeah.
You have to bust your ass and work hard. And in Warren Marshall I had on a couple weeks ago, he was a coder, so he wasn't necessarily an artist from childhood, like a lot of people, but he, again, busted his ass and moved, switched it over to this other lane. And then a guy like Tor is obviously just a natural artist, but that's not enough, right? You've got to really refine the process. It's funny you mentioned Tor because I've made the huge mistake of starting to play Fallout 4. So that's just like all
your time's gone now. Yeah.
Oh God! Like I purposely don't play multiplayer games because I can't. I only play games I can win short. And then you have these games that are like Witcher 3 and Fallout 4 that are like yeah, you can win it, but it's like 300 hours. Anyway, but I was walking around in the game and I walked by a tank and I was like, hey, Tor made that tank.
Right. Yeah, that's the best feeling though, right? To see your things in this world, right?
Yeah, totally. So what's the first? Okay, so you put out some good work, and did you start focusing on weapons? Did you go right from glassware to weapons?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Yeah.
Glass, like stabbing sort of weapon.
I guess, like, humorously, ever since I was a kid, I guess I've had this weird fascination with weapons, and not to sound like a psychopath or anything, but I just think that they're sort of they're beautiful in their own way, right? Like all these firearms and stuff. I mean, they are art. They're brutal art, right, in their own way. And so it's always been one of my favorite parts of games, right? You get the cool weapon, and it feels cool, and you like it, and it looks cool, and all that. So I was really drawn to that as far as process goes, like just the idea of coming up with something that someone could enjoy the same way that I did.
Yeah.
So
did you? So when your first portfolio, so you put together a sort of a portfolio of weapons. I'm showing some of your weapons right now. I agree. Like just to talk about this for a minute, like looking at this gun up here, like I'm not a gun fan. I don't go shooting on the weekend or whatever. But I do understand that, the way I tend to look at it is I'm looking at this right here. There's gun nerds, just like there's camera nerds or,
Absolutely.
And the sort of, like, I love this kind of art. I love all the details on here, like the knurls there and all the little cuts and the holes in the pan. I mean, it's just like, and it's not overdone. There's there's sort of a balance of that. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but just going on your theme there, yeah, it's not psychopathic to see some cool design in a weapon. Like that's, we've been looking at weapons since there were weapons, and they've been works of art. If you look at old, whatever, anything from a samurai sword to, whatever, they've always intermingled with art, right?
Absolutely.
So how did you sort of get noticed? Did you put out portfolios online and people just started talking about, like, look at this dude's stuff, or what?
Yeah. So initially, I really wanted to refine the workflow, right? Because pipeline and workflow are everything. And the Unreal Engine marketplace had just started up not too long before, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna make some packs for this. I'm gonna get this figured out. It was a way to basically get free review from Epic Games, right?
Oh
So you
yeah.
send it into them, and if it passes approval, then you know you've done at least something right. So I
So
threw
was that
together a
your
couple.
own sneaky little way of doing it, or is that an established way of getting noticed?
It just seemed like a good idea, you know. I
Nice.
was working really consistently still in product design, and I decided, hey, if I'm ever going to make this jump, like you said, you got to bust your ass and split your time. When you've got free time, it's got to go to what you're really interested in. And
And so you've got some people from Epic like proving your stuff, getting on the Unreal Marketplace.
yeah.
Looking at your ArtStation page, I noticed you had some. Well, again, we'll look at some of this stuff in more detail later. But you had some stuff from Lawbreakers up there, a multiplayer shooter that came out recently. Yeah, what is the studio behind Lawbreakers?
That's Boss Key Productions, and yeah, the timing was actually really good on that because Trammell had reached out to me right after I had gotten done with Warframe, like to the days before.
Okay.
It was amazing. Yeah, the timing was like impeccable. But he reached out to me. He said, "Hey, we're looking for a hard surface modeler, and can you hook us up?" And we got together on one contract and ended up working for just about a year together. And things went very well there. So yeah.
So you worked on Warframe as well. What is the first game you worked on? Let me ask you that, I guess.
It was the first like major game you could say was Warframe. Yeah, for sure. And that was
where you cashed a
maybe
check.
2000. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a good one, right? Yeah. And I was doing some weapons and add-ons for them, and yeah, so that was sort of reaffirmation that I did understand what I was doing, right?
Right.
Because there's always like that imposter syndrome in this industry, right? Like,
yeah,
you can put out work and it may be good, but you still sort of wonder, like, do I really know what I? Because it's so dense. There's so to really properly get something working in engine that you can send off to animators and VFX and everything tie together, right?
So did you have to learn on the job a little bit there with some feedback from people over at the studio working on Warframe in terms of like getting your assets prepped down to game ready quality assets?
So surprisingly, not really. I had sort of gotten it nailed by that point, I think, for the most part. I mean, you learn with every project that you do, right? It's just sort of the nature of things.
Yeah.
But by then, yeah, I mean, all the technical stuff was worked out, and I had studied pretty hard before then, so I was reasonably confident in the work I was putting out. And then by the time we got to Lawbreakers, I mean, we were really hammering stuff out. And
so now you've got a pretty big body of work, it looks like, at least in terms of being a specialist in weapons modeling.
Yeah.
Now, do you want to continue along this vein, creating weapon type assets for games, or are you like, okay, I've done enough weapons, I want to make armor or animals, or you just stick with hard surface?
So really, yeah, hard surface is my thing, and I think you'll find that with a lot of hard surface game artists, right? Like it really is something that you are attracted to begin with, and I think it's just in your blood. Like if you're really going to do it, beforehand.
Yeah.
And that's not to say even on Lawbreakers I did some first person character arms and some environment stuff, but yeah, it's really, if you're going to do hard surface stuff, I think really anymore specializing is a necessity, right?
Yeah.
You have to make people come to you for a reason, and that's always been it for me. I don't foresee myself changing that up, really.
Well, it is a bit of a catch-22 in this industry. If you, for instance, I work on projects in a small studio, I always have, and you have to be a generalist when you're at a small studio. and because you have to not just in 3D, but you have to be able to composite and edit and everything else if it comes down to it.
Yeah.
But if you're working in a large studio, and again, this is more, my experience is more with people working in the film industry, where, and we talked a little bit about this before going online, back when in like the late 90s or early 90s, sort of like since the original Jurassic Park, people my age, when they wanted to break into the industry, they're really talking about the film industry. And being a specialist was a requirement. You were hired as a specialist. There just weren't necessarily generalists working around who would texture paint one day and do dynamics another day. And in the game industry, I think it depends. Probably, I think you'd agree a little bit on the size of the team. Where if you're in a smaller indie type team, you may be asked to do a wider variety of things, whereas maybe a larger team, like we're going to get the best weapons guy we can get, and that's what he's going to do.
Absolutely. But and to some extent, you're totally right, because even as a freelancer, you need to be very well-rounded, right? Solving technical problems is something you do for your client, right? In that relationship. Right. So, I can't have no knowledge of technical art because that just doesn't work, right? I can't turn something in that I'm not 100% confident in end to end. So, yeah, specialization, I think, on the asset delivery end is important, but you do totally need the full gamut of at least understanding what everyone who's going to interact with your asset is going to do with it. So
I'm putting up a couple of your images on the screen here, and I'm looking at the sort of a plasma pistol, blaster pistol, the Belize.
The Belize Firefly, yeah.
The Firefly. So this one jumped out at me. I just love it. I love the roundness of it. It looks, if a gun could be cute, this is cute, right? This is like and so were you given a concept drawing from this from a different artist, or do they say, hey, Elliot, we need a blaster pistol, give me 3 ideas, and then this is what it wound up being? How did the process work to come to this final model here?
This pistol sort of started a little bit differently, and it did come from a piece of concept art by Elijah McNeil, I believe. And anyways, we got through a little bit of it, and you test it out in game and yada yada yada, and it evolved pretty dramatically. I think you end up really having to do a lot of design on the fly, even if you're working from concept art most of the time. But this, we had an idea of the pistol, and then the design all catered to it in the end. And this is a really interesting piece for that reason, because it started aesthetically more angular, but as we got to looking at the first person view in game and all that, dramatically by the end of the process.
So when you're creating this and going through a sort of a review process, are you showing untextured versions first with no real established direction and what the final look is going to be in terms of the colors and sort of flourishes and things like that? Or are you submitting sort of Rev 1 textured versions along with work in progress geometry as you're creating this asset?
So there's really sort of 2 ways to go down that road. And either on the one hand, you've got established concept art that sort of dictates the final texture. So as long as you can show that the form is progressing and proportional and all that, you're probably good to go.
Do you like having concept art where you can say, hey man, I made it like this? I don't have to
it's adds a certain easy button to that part of the process, right? But I'm good either way. I really love to design things. It's something I've done for a long time, and it's always good to iterate. So even if it's not the whole design process, just sort of iterating on an idea is still rewarding in that way.
So did you rig this up as well? I'm assuming these are multiple meshes, and you did some rigging with the sort of the flare out of the, I guess, is that a reload sequence or like a power shot or something when it's all like flared out like a squid?
Yeah, so it overheats, and then the panels sort of pop out, and it fans itself down essentially to.
Ah, cool.
um,
So do you do the animation for that, or do you hand it off to somebody else?
I do not. I'll often do a very basic rigging to show things off, so it's easy for me.
Uh-huh.
But in this case, Randall Hess at Boss Key rigged and weighted these, and then Zach Lowry, I believe, animated them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
So
really cool. I thought that was really cool how it was kind of opened up like that. So let me see. Let me pull up another image here. Recharge station. Let me look at. So you had the Uzi had shown earlier this very realistic actual weapon versus this one's really cool, the shock croc. Take a look at this guy. Versus these sort of fanciful weapons in Lawbreakers. Like which do you prefer to work on? You prefer to. So what I had mentioned about the concept art is I often like to have like a real life example. For me, if it's a product I'm doing for a client, give me some photos, give me something to match, because it gives me something to work towards. Also, it gives me something to push back against sometimes when you're doing revisions.
right.
So do you prefer to work off matching a real life like a shotgun, or do you like these sort of fanciful, open-ended weapons like you have here with the shock rock?
So I'd say in general, if we were to rank, what is easiest to most difficult to work on and get a good result. So like fantasy stuff is going to be the absolute easiest, right? Because it doesn't have to conform really to what we know as being functional. There's a lot less suspension of disbelief. And then comes, the real life stuff. And that's a tier up because it, has certain physical constraints. It has to work. We're familiar with it. So you can't really screw up or people will know instantly. And then after that is sci-fi, because you're creating something that has to conform to all the things that the real weapon does, but it also needs to be believable in its own special way, right? So
Right.
I think sci-fi weapons, to me, if they're done right, are probably the most rewarding. But I love a good, accurate real weapon for the same reason. Like the real weapon proportions and all, it feels good to know that you sort of replicated that.
Yeah, it's funny. Taking a look at the shotgun here, the Romero's shotgun, and the one of the games I think was really a milestone, at least for me, was Deus Ex. Not Mankind Divided, the previous one.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting it. Like Advanced
Human Revolution.
Human
right?
Revolution.
Yeah.
Deus Ex Advanced Human. No, it's Human Revolution. Right. What I thought about Human Revolution, I thought the art direction was immaculate, and I thought what you're talking about in terms of sci-fi is all the weapons in that game, all the furniture in that game, all the wardrobes in that game looked like it belonged in the same universe, right? Yeah, there's a consistency among the art direction. I'm looking at, it seems like you've achieved that as well with these Lawbreakers weapons. Looking at, you have a similar sort of stylization on a lot of these that, it's like they were made from a similar manufacturer at a similar time frame, right?
And that's, I actually had the privilege of doing most of the Belize weapons. So, Tramel's idea for the brand had, certain guidelines and parameters, and then really being able to have one artist do sort of all the weapons in a particular line, it really helps the process, right? Because like you're saying,
right,
they look like they belong together for that very reason. It didn't get spread out. I mean, it's not to say that, a team can't do that, but I think it shows in a lot of finished art when you sort of get to do a whole class as one artist. And it's funny you say that about Deus Ex, because one of my art books that sits back here all the time is the art of the Deus Ex universe, right? So
there you go. Yeah, wait, hold that up again.
Yeah.
Where did you get that?
Amazon. I've got an insane collection of game art books down here, but this is one of the most
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who worked on that, but that was I thought with that game was fantastic. They really just
Absolutely.
nailed everything. The music, they really just nailed that game.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Even in games where I think I'm not even that crazy about the modeling, like something like BioShock Infinite. I just never really liked
Mm.
the weapons in that game very much, but they definitely belong together. Like there's a
Yeah.
consistency to them.
Yeah.
And I love it that sort of attention to detail is being undertaken. Where you mentioned you give a backstory to just even the manufacturers behind these weapons that wind up in
Right.
the hands of people.
The world building
Um,
that comes along with it, I think, valuable. Yeah.
So somebody's asking, like, how many pieces are your guns mainly made of? So how many different mesh items, I suppose, are you using in each of these? In a standard weapon, I guess, or maybe taking a look at
Sure.
the hammerhead rocket launcher. Let's take a look at this guy here. So, like, how many mesh objects are in this thing?
A hell of a lot. It's not uncommon for me to go to Painter with, like 50 name based baking groups, basically.
Uh-huh.
Um, but
50.
it largely depends. Yeah, because you don't want to waste uh, polygons, and so a lot of times things can be merged into single shells that bake out across different chunks of high poly. But when you've got meshes that animate very heavily and things like that, it's not uncommon to have 50 to 70 different baking groups for me.
Wow. So you're now these were these modeled in MODO?
But this actual weapon originally came from Alan Van Ryzen. He did the high poly in 3ds Max. And
Uh-huh.
I modified it pretty heavily in MODO. I almost exclusively work in MODO these days.
And
Um,
then Substance, obviously,
yeah,
for the texturing. So, like, look at this. I mean, the detail on these is just amazing. So, like, is this the actual game geometry and textures, or is
yeah.
this a high polyverse? This is the actual game asset.
That's my baked down textured game asset on top. Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I couldn't. To me, this looks like a high poly asset. I mean, it just
It baked very well. There's a lot of mirroring too, so much optimization goes into game assets. Like you want to get the highest texel density that you can. That's changing a lot in first person shooters where or for a weapon to have multiple texture sets at lower texture resolutions so that it's easier on the texture buffer. But in a lot of these cases, these are single texture sets, so you need to make sure that you get the most out of the asset. And there's, mirroring and efficient UVs are the name of the game.
so. Well, taking the Belize, plasma pistol, whatever you want to call this, as an example. Looking at the handle, you've got some nice leather textures, some stitching. You got a little logo on there. What you're doing, you only painted half of that handle, correct? And that's a
Right.
that's a mirrored UV. Well, it's actually an overlapping UV set to get it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
And
you make the mirror and then, offset it, bake it, and then move everything back. Yeah. And you effectively double your.
and what resolution is the single texture coming out at?
So I'll initially bake everything at 8K and then work in 4K. So you get the extra, super sampling effect. But almost
Oh, okay.
weapons will, textures in general almost rarely go into a game at 4K. You need a lot of 2K stuff and textures map and will,
Right.
LOD down, all that. So,
But you're keeping in the highest resolution possible
yeah.
prior to that. So what about Substance? Let's go back on Substance, because that's a program that's really I think taken the industry by storm in a
Mhm.
way that hasn't been done since ZBrush,
I agree with
where
that. Yeah.
if you're would you think that if you're doing texturing or creating game assets, looking at your recharge pack here, that you've got to learn Substance? Is that just you need to learn this? I don't care what you model in, but you need to learn Substance. Do you feel that way?
I really do. These days, everybody wants the files delivered in Substance. Um, the for a while, Quixel had a pretty good market share with the Quixel suite, but it's not as convenient. It's not as packed up. It's easy for files to get lost 3 years into a project, right? But if Substance Painter file that has all the base textures done, you've got 15 skins for the weapon saved in layer stacks that are turned off. There is no, oh, we lost whatever. So I think it's half convenience. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what you mentioned is a lot of this stuff just becomes digital asset management at some point, right? And it seems that Algorithmic really put some effort into that aspect of their programs.
Very much so. I think, they're doing it better than anyone else. The old way was to export your stuff into XNormal. You'd have to do an exploded bake and then a together AO bake, and that's really was a pain in the ass. And now, you can ship the model out one time, do all the baking that you need, and everything is compartmentalized, and
you're delivering the substance file as well as the geometry to the client.
So yeah, that is one thing. The geometry you cannot extract from a painter file, so you need to make sure that when you hand off your painter files, not only do you give, and this is, in my experience, the game ready mesh, but I'll also deliver a painter mesh that is in the same world space that the model was exported at, so that if they want to make changes or separate things, you can pull it back into Painter. Painter will redo all the calculations, end up not losing any data if you need to shuffle things around.
So just looking at some of your staffs now, looks like you use Zbrush and some Marmoset as well. But let me ask you a little bit about the detailing, like the neurals. I'm looking at the caster weapon pack, the Elemental Scepter. But so a lot of these similar sorts of details are on the weapons as well, where you have a knurled texture or a grip texture or little rivets or cuts. Now, used to be, there's a couple different methods for creating that stuff, right? You can create it as an actual geometry and modeling program and bake it down as a normal map, or you may use ZBrush. But Substance Painter maybe has taken some of that workload now. Do you do some of that stuff in Substance now, the detailing?
So I really still do the majority of my detailing in model. And the reason for that is so that if it has to be baked later, if it gets iterated on, you don't wind up losing any detail work that you've done.
Interesting.
But Painter has actually come a long ways in that regard, because they've got a new anchoring system, which allows you, if you've painted normal detail, it can be referenced in the generators for like ambient occlusion and things like that. So it's become exponentially more powerful in that regard, I think.
So looking at your shotgun again in the untextured view, like I see a number of like little rivet details on sort of behind the sights there. So are that's actual geometry, or
that
those
whole
are
thing that's geometry straight out of MODO? Yeah.
Even the stitching on the handle?
Yeah. So what I do for that is I'll create an edge in the high poly and split it off into a new mesh item, and then convert it to a curve. I'll model my stitch and then duplicate it along the curve, and you've got instant stitching. Yeah.
Okay, so you edges to curves, and you're duplicating along the curve. Are you replicating on a curve, or are you using a mesh operation? Okay, so replicating.
Yeah, it's just the replicator. Yeah.
So I think definitely a lot of people watching this are MODO users, but just because again, as a game artist, there's a lot of interest in this industry. There's definitely people watching this who are Max users or Maya users. At some point, you switched from Max to MODO. Was that by necessity? You had a client who wanted you to work in MODO, or you did a trial and thought, hey, it's kind of cool. I like copying and pasting my polygons.
Yeah, no kidding. I guess it happened in MODO 701. I started a trial. I had been looking at some of Tor's work, and poly count was a great way to just interact with people and all that.
Right.
And, yeah, so I did a trial, and I immediately was just like, this this feels better, right? It's almost an intrinsic thing. It's kind of hard to explain that to people. But in Max, I feel like I'm sending to a moon rover, right? Where it's like, you know, do this, and it's very hands off. But in MODO, I feel like I can hammer stuff out extremely fast. And
well, yeah, you definitely in MODO had it. It almost feels like you're whipping around polygons like you are pixels in Photoshop. It just
absolutely.
Just cut, paste, align the work plane, paste it there, move it around, dragging instead of grabbing tool handles, things like that. I think are they're the earliest parts of MODO, and to be honest, they're still the best parts of MODO. And they're that and the shader tree to some aspects are what sets that program apart. I used Max way back in the day, but I still use Maya consistently, and that just that's what makes MODO different from all those other programs.
I agree. A lot of what MODO I think excels at is quality of life, right? So not only does it have great modeling tools out of the box, the whole paradigm of MODO is that they give you pieces to put together to make your own tools. And you know, in a lot of cases, I feel that people will come over from Max and they'll be like, well, MODO can't do this or doesn't do that. But that's really not ever true. It's just it does it differently. And going through and investigating and, you know, figuring out what works for you, I can doubled my production speed from Max to MODO. And MODO's keybind system out of the box is probably unparalleled, right? So contextual keybinds inside of tools, creating your own tools on the fly and then assigning them new keybinds. In Max, if I want to keybind all of my things, I am writing Max script that will allow me to do keybinds, right?
Right. And so, you know, if you're not a MODO user, one of the things he's talking about here, and every MODO user I talk to who works at a very high level, like Elliot or Torfrick or somebody like that, does massive amount of customization on their tools, which makes sense. If you're sitting in front of the same tool 8 to 10 hours a day, every day, day after day for years, of course you're going to customize it. MODO does allow you to not just assign tools to keys, but functions of tools to keys. So, you know, a bevel tool or an extrude tool, or all these tools can have their own keyboard shortcuts that operate when that tool is active. So and to be fair, like the UI for, you know, creating customizations and some of the methods in MODO could be better, and I think will be coming up. Joe Angel is responsible for that. Joe, if you're watching, I've known Joe for years. I've been beta tested in MODO since the old days. Come on, Joe. I know Joe's working hard. Joe works really hard. Also has a DeLorean, I believe.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting.
Right. So you're using MODO, and then going to. So let me ask you this: using Substance in MODO, another Pixel Fondue contributor, Emmanuel Flores, created a live link between. I think it works with MODO, Maya, and Blender between Substance and MODO, swapping geometry back and forth. Have you tried that yet?
I haven't. You know, I keep my scenes pretty tidy, so usually when it's time to export over to Painter, I already know what I'm going to get when I get there, and rarely ever do I have to, you know, do a geometry swap up or anything like that.
You've got your workflow set. So somebody's asking if you're using the rounded edge shader a lot within MODO, and then I assume baking those and going into Substance that way.
So it's one of the great, like, it depends, right?
Right.
I find that you can get away with a lot more of that in environment art and things. I use it occasionally, but sub-D work is heavily portable, and interoperable. So if I'm making something in MODO, knowing that it's going to Maya or Max at the end of the day, maybe changed by the team later or anything like that, it's still the safest bet. But
sub-D is Cadmo Clark sub-Ds. So
right.
So a lot of these weapons you're working in sub-Ds for the
100% of them. Yeah.
100% sub-D. All right, let's back up here because I'm a little. All right, so if you're using sub-Ds for this workflow, are you Boolean it? You can't. Well, unless you're using mesh fusion, you can't really Boolean with sub-Ds. How are you making all these little cuts? You're just edge weighting and hand modeling all the little panels and cuts on your weapons.
MODO's got great tools. I mean, yeah, so I make heavy use of mop boolean, right? If you do hard surface work in MODO and you don't own William Vaughn's mop booleans, you should make a new tab and go buy it right now.
Well, that's a ringing endorsement from somebody who's creating artwork like this. So go ahead.
I was gonna say the process really for me is to create a block out that's going to be the silhouette of the finished low poly mesh, and I'll duplicate that off. You know, it's oftentimes Boolean, and at that point, I'd tackle it with lots of control loops. And MODO has awesome tools for edge selection and angle selection, storing selection sets. I'll do a lot of square chamfer. So what, you know, you have a lot of Max users that are like, well, you know, MODO can't do this on the fly or parametrically or whatever, and that's really not the case. It's just done differently. So
right, and they've actually, there's going to be more and more improvements along those lines as MODO starts to add more sort of procedural or parametric tools to MODO as they convert some of the sort of straight ahead modeling tools to mesh operations. But let me go back a little bit, because you're doing a, let's call it a Tor Frick style blockout, where Tor moves very quickly. I'm assuming maybe inspired you to maybe work that way, where we've seen Tor in a live stream mesh out or like block out a really complex robot in like 45 minutes or something. You know?
Right.
And he's just moving very quickly using mop booleans, using mirroring and quick MODO duplication and cloning and stuff like that, or popping in cylinders and doing quick bubbles. And so you're doing that as a block out. And once you're happy with the silhouette and how it looks, this sort of jumble of shapes and polys, then you're going to like start going after part by part and creating tight Catmull Clark sub D meshes of each part.
That's right. Yeah. And so, you know, I think traditionally has been a process that people are like, well, that's slow, yada, yada, yada. This piece was done in 2 days.
This recharge station,
totally textured. Yeah.
The recharge station?
That's correct.
Yeah. Two days, textured and modeled. Do you ever worry that you're working too fast and do they pay you by the model or by the day?
Actually, yeah, a lot of freelance work is itemized.
Right.
So, you know, it does behoove you to get fast. But
to get fast, right. So you're better off working fast. Like, you're not paid by the hour here, folks. You gotta work.
Right, yeah.
I mean, this is a super clean looking model. You know, I remember in the older days, it was show me your wires, and everybody's gonna like, you know, pick apart your model and see where you screwed up on a quad or something. But you know, what you mean by portable, you are correct. Catmull Clark sub Ds will go into at least Maya exactly out of MODO. I assume like any sort of program that supports Catmull Clark sub Ds. So if you can create an asset like this with Catmull Clark sub Ds, not only is it portable between programs, but it's essentially resolution independent. I mean, you can freeze this down at multiple levels.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's one of MODO's strengths is that it plays so well with other, you know, industry standard products. I think a lot of people are afraid that, you know, the results they'll get out of MODO, you know, won't fit in the pipeline or whatever. I think studios feel that way often, but
yeah, I think exactly. And geometry is easy enough to move around. I think the Foundry can maybe alleviate some of that with the live link stuff they're doing. If they get a live link with Maya or Max, where you could just like push a button, your model shows up, just the correct scale. It's, you know, the edge weighting is there. Then it's, you know, done. There's no like jumping through hoops to get it in.
Right. And, you know, MODO has a very sort of distinct process to it. Like I can get very predictable results out of it every single time and know that they'll make it to Maya or Unreal Engine or whatever, really before you even have to test it. Because
right,
one of the things I really enjoy about MODO is that it doesn't hide information from you, right?
Right.
Everything is always available. So in behind menus or behind modifiers, your data is just there. So the constant sort of review and revision is kept in check by just the accessibility of it.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, because I'll often get scenes in Maya from a collaborator, and I'm just like, okay, what the hell did they do with this one? And because you gotta
Right,
dig in.
right.
Modo, these are, again, it's a similar, almost like Photoshop, unless you're using some mesh operations. It's just like what you see is what you get. That there's nothing sneaky going on behind the scenes. This is your
Right.
model. So, do you use polystyrene at all? Polystyrene being sort of the method where you're grabbing assets from a kit bash, and just using a bridge-like command to weld them on to a sub-D model?
So yeah, I use a hell of a lot of polystyrene as well, and my kit bash library. So I don't have any sort of externally sourced components in that, but I use it for really bolts and specific styles, and I use it a lot for floating geometry, which it's quite good at now.
So with floating geometry, you want to bring in your prefab or your kit bash part, and you're just using maybe rounded edge shading or something to blend that in.
Yeah, a lot of times edge weighting.
Weighting.
I'll put it, and this is a cool thing that not a lot of people know about painters' name-based baking conventions. But if you have, say, for this weapon, if I had floaters on it, and my suppressor was named suppressor_low, and then I had suppressor_high, I could also have suppressor_high_floaters be reflected, or respected rather, in Painter as falling into the same naming group. That's a pretty cool trick to keep your mesh items.
Might have to get a tutorial from you up on Pixel Fondue to do this. Like, also, yeah, have you thought about releasing your kit bash library like Tor did and selling it?
So my kit bash library at this point has too many items in it that were proprietary, so to speak.
Right, yeah.
But definitely a distilled down version I've thought about doing. I really thought about doing tutorials and things, but time is tricky.
Time is tricky. Looking at this is maybe Marmoset viewer or
yeah, that's the 15 megabyte limit days, so it's
oh, okay.
It's a little rough. Yeah,
I really like what Sketchfab and Marmoset are doing with allowing you to bring these things online. So somebody's asking, are you, to get from this sub-D model to this triangulated mesh, are you doing a retopo, or are you just doing a sort of, are you just doing a procedural, like just going down to sub-D level 1 and then triangulating, or how are you getting to this particular model?
So I save all of my blockouts before I ever lay a control loop on the mesh for subdivision. I'll duplicate that off, and in MODO, I assign it a different color. You can do like the color for your mesh items. And that stays until the high poly is finished, and I go back to those blockouts because your silhouette should be reflected in those, and I refine it down from there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is so. I mean, it's funny because, and the way you're describing it sounds like a ton of work, but you're still pumping these things out in a few days.
Yeah.
So clearly, it works. You're just fast.
Yeah, I guess a lot of it is your process, right? Keybinds and things like that. To do a lot of these things, I feel like the conception that Max will yield faster results, a slow workflow, right?
Right.
There's a really important concept in 3D, I think, to bring with you, is that you have to begin with the end in mind, right? So at no point in the process should you be neglecting your finished product, right?
That's a really good bit of advice.
Yeah,
you have to have the end in mind at the beginning of the project. It's a world. It's not necessarily true with like sketching, right? Because it's a much simpler process. Once you jump into the world of 3 dimensions and there's no limit on what you can do, you damn well better have an end in mind, or you're never going to get there.
Absolutely.
Looking at some of the shields here, what's the shield for? What is this from a game?
It went in a pack for Unreal Engine as well. This is part of the experimentation.
Oh, this is the okay, very cool. Did you model that design on the front, or is that a normal map?
So I did a block out in MODO and then took this to Zbrush. That is all ZBrushed in.
Oh, of course.
And
right,
yeah.
So do you find yourself using ZBrush a lot or less and less, or now that it has more of a hard surface, ZBrush obviously put a lot of work into the hard surface aspect of this last iteration.
Yeah.
Are you going there, or have you just hadn't had the time to check it out yet, or do you use it? What do you think of it?
So ZBrush has sort of a couple different roles right now. There is a very popular workflow that uses 3ds Max's Pro Boolean and dumps that data straight into ZBrush, where it can be dynameshed and polished. And I replicate that workflow in MODO occasionally. It's still not my preferred method to deliver.
Is there a technical difference between doing it in Max and MODO, or does Max spit out quads or something?
Well, it really comes down to Max's ability to have very easily generated procedural primitives, right? So what you can do is crank the side count way up, and then when you send it off to ZBrush and you just throw a straight Dynamesh on it, the geometry is dense enough and round enough that when you throw a polish on, you get pretty good results. I mean, it's akin to just having done it sub D in most cases. But,
it sounds like you're getting a little bit of sub D, but it's a little bit faster maybe if you're doing
cylinders and things. Yeah.
But on the back end, you've got to re-topo that.
Well, see, that's part of the beauty of it, because in Pro Boolean, and I do this with mop booleans in MODO, but I think the industry is sort of using the Pro Boolean way. You go back in and you select all these individual Boolean operations, and you just dial down the edge count, right? And you use turn to poly, and boom, you've got your low poly done.
And then you're just baking the details from ZBrush down onto that low poly mesh.
Right.
That's really interesting. I wonder if you could do that with Mesh Fusion, but you just unsub D. Well, you'd have to edge weighting maybe could do it. You'd have to unsub D all the items, and then they use the MODO booleans to boolean them together.
Right. Mop boolean works pretty good with the ZBrush workflow. There are a few max modifiers like turn to poly that MODO really doesn't have a great answer to, but it's not that big of a deal, right? Because you're talking about some pretty basic primitives by the time you get done simplifying them, and then it's a matter of making sure you don't have n-gons and
this is taking an interesting turn. I want to get back to this image in just a second, but what you're saying essentially is that workflow rules, like we're not talking about features, we're talking about workflow.
Yeah.
And there's particular workflows that come in and out of existence, I think just sort of dynamically through people sharing them, and they may blossom at one studio and then move to another one, or somebody online does some amazing stuff and you're like, oh crap, how are you doing that? And that sort of filters its way throughout the industry. So you have a workflow right now you're talking about with Max and Pro Booleans and going to ZBrush, and like it comes in nicely in ZBrush. You can detail it up, bake that down, go back to Max, just res everything back down to low res, apply that ZBrush fine finish on there, and hey, we're like 90% of the way there. So if I was Foundry, I would want to understand that workflow really well, and then have a strategy to offer something even better in MODO. At least that's the way I would approach it. Like, what about MODO would you like to see improved? And I think this is going to be, when you have a game artist of your caliber come on and give their opinion on this, I think the developers listen, because they see stuff like this. They're like, they love seeing good stuff done with their tools, and this is the best kind of feedback, is getting the sort of feedback from somebody like you or Tor, somebody who just who's refined their workflow down to the smallest detail, and has to wind that maze around missing features or breaks in workflow or oddities about the program. So like, what do you bump into on a regular basis that you're like, okay, fix this, why can't they fix this, has anybody told them about this? Here's your chance to like air it out.
Sure, yeah. I realize that a lot of the MODO paradigm is to have separate components that you put together into tools, but I really think the program as a whole would benefit from having a couple of single button deformer actions built into the main toolkit. Lattice deformers out of the box are an extreme pain in the ass to use. Whereas, if you run into a Max user, they're practically addicted to them, right? And it's the one button, you just click it and you throw your lattice deformer on and you go. I think that MODO should embrace a bit of that. I teach MODO occasionally, and that I think is one of the things that students have the hardest time grasping as well, is like, okay, just to do this basic action takes like 5 steps, right?
Yeah,
cured through scripts, but
that's not a real solution. Yeah,
I agree.
So you're thinking about some deformation abilities like a lattice deformer, which has been around. A lattice deformer is one of the most basic modeling tools, been around since the 90s. Super useful, and other programs do it, do it differently, do it better. I'm familiar with Maya's. It's easier to set up in Maya. And MODO, it's not just setting it up, but actually, I think working with the lattice handles isn't so great either.
Yeah, and then you have to apply it and remove. The default way is not a great experience.
It's implemented more as an animation tool than a modeling tool.
I agree.
And I'd like to see, some sort of even like a background mesh cage deformer, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
maybe an influence on every point in a background mesh. Something they may be, maybe something like that would be a good tool. So I'm getting a message here from Foundry. They said we're listening, so that's good. So some sort of a deformation tool. But looking at your models, you're doing a ton of like cuts and obviously some like asset placement from a kit bash kit with bolts and things like that. Anything you can see to improve that workflow?
As far as like the cuts and things are concerned, the tools right now are pretty good. I'll usually just edge extrude into the object and build my control loops on the outside. So that's good to go. I do think that the sort of preset browser system could be done a little bit better as far as just easily integrating things. If I could just click and drag, things right onto the mesh from a preset browser, that would be ideal, I think.
Well, how about this? Even click and drag, but one of the things I was thinking about is, you think about working with a font in Photoshop. You type out your word, the font list is active, and you just start going through your fonts until you find the one you like. If the preset browser is live and you drag a bolt on, you're like, no, I want slightly differently. You just arrow key down the list of bolts until you find the one you like, instead of having to re-drag and drop. Something along those lines where, why not have a live link? You have profiles. This is getting a little bit detailed MODO talk here. And if you're not into it, then just give us a second. But you have like with mesh operations, you can have profiles and things like that are live, right? So you can grab profiles from a asset directory, like a preset directory on a bevel, and you can swap them in and out and get different bevels. Well, why not just have a mesh, mesh operation where you can swap out a mesh from a preset browser. It's just a place mesh operation, and that could be swapped out at any time. So, a week down the road, somebody's like, the factory that makes these guns uses 6-sided screws instead of 8-sided screws, or whatever it is, and you could just swap out a different mesh or a different site or whatever it is. I think things like that are going to help people iterate more, because at the end of the day, the quality of these game assets is just unbelievable. And there's such a high volume of them. Like, let me go back to this weapon again. And if this is that pistol, I love this thing with the glowing, glowing bullets. You know, you got to crank out these things, like, and
Absolutely.
so you've got to have, again, it's about workflows to getting to the end more quickly. Not as much about features anymore. Like, you know, when's the last time a feature has been new? Like, you know, something like a bevel or you know, like, you know, it's more about workflow nowadays. This particular thing is really cool. Is this something you made on your own, or is this for a game?
Yeah, I just it was a bit of a personal project. I believe at the time I was wanting to get a student to better understand texturing. And so I came up with a piece that could be, you know, give it to them and say, hey, you know, here's what my version looks like. Here's what I did. You know, see what you can do with it. And I actually decided to give this one away. So there's a free download link for this.
Oh, there's a free download link for this. All right, we'll put that up on the description in the Pixel Fondue blog. So you mentioned a student. Do you still teach, or this is you don't have time for that anymore?
Just privately and very occasionally, right?
Privately and occasionally. Okay.
So
I know William does that.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I know William Bond does that as well.
Yeah.
And some other people, like, yeah, so you get a private. So and this was this Substance as well, looks like.
This one was Quixel Suite. So this was back before Substance had really established their dominance. There was a bit of a beta versus VHS war for a bit.
Right. That's right. Substance came through.
Yeah.
You know, it's really like Substance Painter in particular has just become like Substance is always the actual node-based texture creation tool. Has been around longer. But I think when Painter came out, just like a low-cost 3D painting program that you could jump into, is when really Substance took off.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Painter 1, the early version was a bit lacking, but now it's an absolute powerhouse. And if you really have the fundamentals down from the Photoshop days, you can do amazing things with it in half the time.
Yeah, it is really cool. I'm actually trying to get my head around it now. I don't typically do this kind of work, but I've just got sick of watching all of Wes's Substance videos and like not being able to do any of that stuff. I got to learn this one as I was leaving. So, all right. So I don't know what else. Anything we haven't covered? It's been about an hour. I think we've gone through this in pretty good detail. Any advice you'd give people who are like, you know what? I want to be in the games industry. I'm sick of making glassware. I don't want to move from you know, Middle Tennessee State or whatever. Like, where do we?
Yeah.
How
you
do
you just have to bust your ass. I mean, there is no substitute for it. And
bust your ass.
Fully understanding. Yeah, understand the pipeline. Understand all the technical details of what you're doing. There is no substitute for that, right? If your bakes look terrible and you don't understand why, go read. You know, dig down. It's especially if you're going to be a freelancer, because you have to deliver the perfect product, or you're costing your clients more money if they have to fix it, right?
Yeah, you need to be reliable, right? People are looking for reliable contractors. And I know once you make a name for yourself as a hard worker and as a reliable person, also I think probably easy to work with. You're not going to like argue, you know, you're not going to cling to having 4 stitches instead of 3 on the handle. You know, it's like, okay, fine, I'll change it. And you're right. Like Ryan Drew used to work at Foundry. I remember when he was first starting to learn MODO, he would show up at user meetings we used to have here in Silicon Valley, and we'd always have a little thing at the beginning where you'd go up and show some work if you want to. And Ryan always had something to show. He was just he was just young. He wanted to be in the industry. He'd always show up as a little USB stick, plug it in, and like, here's like this thing I made last week. This thing. And he's just putting himself out there. And, then he got, worked at ILM. I think he's over at Apple right now. And that was just from, like you said, busting your ass, putting yourself out there. Like, don't be afraid to put yourself out there. I think at some point you got to use your real name too.
Absolutely. Hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
I get more inquiries from my personal website than I do from ArtStation, even if people find me on ArtStation, right?
Yeah.
So it's important that you're a person, because essentially you're a product. You're building your own brand, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
I even think like having one of the things we do at Pixel Fondue is we have a page where I want everybody to have a picture of themselves, like their actual face, because I just think it's important to present yourself as a human being with a first and last name and a face. And I think if you do that, you're treated as a human being, and you start to, like you said, build a brand. I kind of hate that phrase, like build your brand, build your brand. But
sure,
it
seems soulless, right? But it's important.
It does, but it's until they come up with a less soulless phrase. That's the phrase to me. And if you're a freelancer, that's your job, right? If you're not actively working on a project, your job until you wake up and go to bed is to continue to build your brand and learn new stuff.
Absolutely, every day. Yeah, if you're not consistently learning, you're probably doing something wrong. And things in the industry change at the drop of a hat. So you have to be ready to just eat up new material. And it's very important.
All right. Well, I think we'll probably wrap it up. It's been about an hour. We're going to link to your ArtStation page and some other links down below. Elliot, you're always welcome back on. I should probably get you and Tor and a couple other guys on at the same time, and talk about trends in gaming, and maybe more of a 1,000-foot view of where gaming is going. I'd love to talk about, looking at some of Adobe's recent announcements at Max, using AI to assist in the creation of art. That stuff's coming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. Yeah.
So we should maybe talk about that, and not so much from what's out there, but what would actually help an artist. So if there's people who are developing these types of tools, and I know Foundry, Autodesk, Adobe, they're all going to be utilizing AI in asset creation. So, so that'll be interesting. So, all right. So why don't we wrap it up? And thanks a lot for coming on. Is it cold in Arkansas? Is it snowing there?
It may be 70 one day and 30 the next. So it's weird.
Okay. Yeah. It's a little farther south than where I grew up in Nebraska, where it's just this is freeze your ass off time of year now.
Right.
But okay, all right. Well, enjoy the weekend, and we'll catch you, everybody. Thanks for joining in. Let me check for questions one last time in case somebody had some desperately needed last question here. Sebastian Larson, synced normals workflow makes everything uber fast. UV mapping automatically and exporting like it's going out of fashion. Sounds like that's more of a statement, maybe about.
It's a factual one, yeah. And MODO's inclusion of MIC-T for baking is amazing too. I think
MIC-T going to Unreal Engine.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
But you, depending on what engine you use, you may wind up, if you're using IdTech or something, you might be using a different normal.
Correct.
Right. That's one of the things, somebody who doesn't create game assets, but occasionally has to do a Unity project or something for VR or something like that. That's the thing that I always you start delving into the world of different normals. That is a
tangent basis. Yeah.
That's an immediate, God, I don't want to learn this stuff. But it's important.
But it's so important.
It's super important, right? Until we have unlimited geometry in games, normal maps are not going anywhere.
If you're turning in, an asset that's got shading errors because you got a tangent problem, that's unacceptable.
Yeah,
right?
So you're gonna get yelled at lunch break, right?
Yeah.
This son of a bitch keeps giving me. All right.
Exactly.
All right. So, advanced viewport. What's his take? Would a more game-friendly viewport be good in his opinion? I'm guessing yes.
I love the advanced viewport. Yeah, I've got it set up with shadows on and ambient occlusion. And I just go to town. I have about 35% specular, and my roughness is set at 40%, and I use a dark gray, and I model everything like that, and it's great. I mean, you can see every single sort of surface aberration that'll show up in a normal map in the advanced view right now, and it runs great on good hardware. So yeah.
Yeah, I think they've made good strides in advanced viewport. I love anti-aliased wireframes. I always have those turned on.
Yeah. Hey, I do have a one weird thing. If the Foundry wants to reach out to me about this,
and that is
if I have full line anti-aliasing on and my edges turned on, and I go to an orthographic view, my edges disappear.
Oh, I can answer that.
Sad.
So go into go into get the options up there under the advanced viewport options, change it from the MODO, like custom, change it to system anti-ist wireframes.
Yeah,
And it'll work.
that's what I do.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh,
But full looks so good, That's
yeah, they know it's a bug. That's going to be fixed. Also, I think they need to up their game in ambient occlusion. I think their ambient occlusion needs to be better.
I agree. If it could be adaptive, that would be cool.
Adaptive ambient occlusion. I think because ambient occlusion is actually something that helps you model.
I agree.
There's some good feedback there, and there's some other issues that I know they're working on. Actually, Foundry, Shane, the product manager, is on. I think last week mentioned they are doing a full UI rewrite. Don't expect it like tomorrow, but it will be coming. And I'm sure everything was gearing towards the advanced viewport. And I know a lot of their multiple products, I think, in the Foundry are both operating off a similar code base there. I think so. That is good. Let's see. I think I'm just looking here. Anything else? I think we're good. The blue glow looks awesome. Yes, it does. Okay. All right. You get back to work making your weapons. I am going to probably go eat some lunch, and we will catch everybody else. I think we're going to have people from Chaos Group on next week. We'll talk about V-Ray. Use V-Ray at all? I guess I don't know if you
not a lot of offline rendering going on over here. Yeah,
not a lot of offline rendering. V-Ray does have a really nice edge shader, actually, a little bit even better than MODO's. So something that does, if you do CAD type rendering like I do, V-Ray's got a nice edge shader. But V-Ray showing up in Unreal Engine too, though. So there may be some crossover there. But we'll see if we can get V-Ray up next week, and then look for Elliot online, and maybe we could talk him into a tutorial or something.
Appreciate you having me on, and I'd be all about it. Yeah.
All right. Take it easy, everybody. Have a good weekend.